Then what we need to do is to address the consequences of migration, both ensuring that the newly arrived are not exploited on the one hand, and that those here for generations are not undercut on the other hand. And there are real problems. In the world of work, what we've sought to tackle with other unions here, the two-tier labour market, more and more migrant agency workers on poorer conditions of employment being exploited, and indigenous workers here for generations on better conditions of employment being undercut. There's also tensions in local communities, for example, around housing. And it's crucially then what we do about it, because the last thing we do is to demonise migrant workers because there are bad employers who exploit, or because there's a lack of decent and affordable housing. Now, I sat on both the TUC Commission on Vulnerable Employees and the government's Vulnerable Workers Forum, and what I want to do today is to argue that everyone with responsibility has to act. 5 points. First, we as unions have to act in the world of work, giving leadership and organising all workers around equal treatment of all workers, reaching out to those hard to reach, as we've done, for example, organising 3,000 cleaners in Canary Wharf in the City of London, here in our capital. We also need to resource that effort, and we've done precisely that. We have 80 organisers. I'm very proud to say they look very different from our traditional officer corps. 1/3 are migrant workers, 1/3 are women, and nearly 1/3 are under 30. Not good enough, but we're making strong progress in the right direction. So first and foremost, we as unions have a responsibility. Secondly, employers, of course, have a responsibility. Our job is to work with, but also to tackle the bad employers, and we do precisely that. And there are both good and bad examples of how employers respond. Can I give a good example? First Bus. We've had our ups and our downs with First Bus. But when First Bus needed to recruit large numbers of Eastern European drivers, their approach was a model. Working with us in terms of how the workers were recruited, how they were greeted when they came to this country, how they were integrated into the workforce, equal treatment with their indigenous brothers and sisters, help, pastoral care, help with housing. It was a model, and as a consequence, there's not been tensions in First Bus. But on the other hand, you get employers like Blue Diamond. Do you remember, very proud to say, we got Blue Diamond sacked off the London Tube when they brought 400 Bulgarians here 3 years ago and decided that they were all self-employed on the national minimum wage, paying for their own safety equipment. We managed to persuade that contract to be terminated, to send a lesson to employers of that kind. I kid you not, for a year afterwards, I had complaints from the chief executive saying we can't get any more contracts. Eventually they went out of business. Good. My third responsibility is all those with power need to discharge that responsibility. In particular, the supermarkets. Because there's no question of it, if you look at the food industry supply chain and the logistics supply chain, what happens is that supermarkets abuse their market power to drive down costs along the supply chain, and that in turn leads to that two-tier labour market. Now, some progress has been made over the last 10 years through the Ethical Trading Initiative, and we welcome that. But for too many in the world of retail, the ethical is a logo on the letterhead, and it is not put into practice day in, day out in the way that it should be. And crucially now, together, as Margaret knows, with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, there is an inquiry being conducted, the first of its kind, very welcome indeed, into that pattern of structural discrimination in the food industry supply chain. My view is, and the Commission is doing an excellent work tackling this with vigour, that what it will do is to establish a new ethical norm. You know how we all talk about procurement? We tend to focus, do we not, on public sector procurement. It's also about supply chain management in the private sector. And if we establish a new ethical norm through the Commission, that you cannot procure in a way that creates structural discrimination in your supply chain, I think the power of that will be absolutely enormous. Fourth, statutory, voluntary organisations, civil society have a responsibility to act. You get good councils like Slough on the one hand, coping with a huge inward migration now for 30 and 40 years. But they need help. And on the other hand, the churches, who I think have given excellent leadership. We work very closely, for example, with London Citizens and the Citizens Organising Foundation. And as somebody who was born and brought up a Catholic, I have to say not practicing one, I think I'm described as a cultural one, I'm very proud of the leadership that's been given by the churches, reaching out to and being a champion of migrant workers, including, by the way, being a champion of the absolutely legitimate and difficult cause of regularisation, because eventually government's going to have to come to terms with the fact that you can't hunt down and deport 800,000 undocumented workers. Fifth and finally, government has to act. Now, Chair, I always leave government to last, not because the role of government is not crucial. It is absolutely crucial. But I sometimes think there's a tendency in this great movement of ours always to point at government and say, if you acted, all would be well. Well, actually, it starts with our own responsibility and then challenging others in the way that I have. But of course, government has to act. Now, that requires leadership being given by government. And I have to say, I think there are sometimes mixed messages coming out of government. I'm not a fan of some of the headline-chasing comments that Phil Wallace has made in particular. But leadership is crucial. But it's then what government does in practical terms. And we spell out some examples of that. I'm very pleased to say, I know Pat McFadden addressed you this morning. I don't know if you made reference to the Fair Employment Board that I sit on. 3 months' time, there'll be the launch of a major drive bringing together the enforcement agencies to clamp down on employers who exploit vulnerable workers, generally migrant workers in particular, here in Britain. That was one of the proposals that came out of the TUC Commission on Vulnerable Employees. Government also needs to address, of course, this very difficult issue arising out of the European Court of Justice judgments, so that we don't get domestic legal protection or domestic collective agreements undercut. Crucially, government needs to extend the law. One area where it is moving down the right path, although we've got to get it right, is equal treatment of agency workers and the directly employed. And at the next stage, is a big issue will be precisely how will that work. But another area where agreement was reached last year with government that they would commission a study on is to extend gangmasters, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, to cover into construction. Because there's clear evidence of growing abuse in construction. As the Chair said, I was proud to coordinate the coalition around bringing the Gangmasters Licensing Act into law. It's a highly effective organisation, still in its infancy, but it's highly effective. It's gone after bad employers. Already we're seeing evidence of raising standards in food and agriculture. Crucially, its terms of reference need to be extended also to cover construction. Now, there are other issues, of course, in our communities. Social cohesion issues, housing is an absolutely critical one. Of that, there's absolutely no doubt. But for government, therefore, it is about leadership, enforcing the law, extending the law as appropriate. Now, if I can just say this in conclusion, Chair, is I live in the real world. I've often said I'm not an ivory tower trade unionist. I live in the real world. And I know that these are difficult issues. And I know of the tensions that there are, including tensions that have been heightened by recession. But we've got a decision to make in the trade union movement. Do we run in front of a tide of xenophobia, or do we give the necessary leadership? But leadership is not enough. Not what we say, it's what we do. It's how we act. Thank you very much, Chair.